Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 15 pilot or first episodes or series premiere episodes. In this video I will count down my top 15 favorite first episodes, sometimes referred to as pilot episodes, or although often the case maybe it's not exactly a pilot, I'm not sure, or it's the series premiere, the first episode in a show from all of my favorite shows, counting down my top 15 favorite ones. Now this is a Patreon requested video, requested by Patreon Ricky. Thanks Ricky so much for suggesting this. And so in this video I will attempt to name my 15 favorite pilot episodes or first episodes from my favorite shows. So this was a very, very hard list. And Ricky always does this. Will make suggestions of lists that are very hard to do. But this one in particular I found very hard because I typically don't like pilot episodes that much. Like, I feel like with most shows, particularly the shows I like, they get better after the first episode. The first episode is just like the introduction, and they don't really pick up until later on. So it was hard for me to try to pin down, and so I picked 15 episodes that I remember that were sort of good starts that really got me engaged with the show from the beginning. Now, not all of these shows maintain their quality. Some of them would dip or go up and down in quality, or maybe not be that good for the rest of the show. But I do recall that these first episodes were really, really good and really got me invested right away. So let me go ahead and get started with my countdown. Let's start with my number 15, which is Raised by Wolves, a show that was recently canceled only after 2 seasons, but I do recall, and it got really weird, but I do recall the first episode really blowing me away, sort of really getting into the dreary tone of the show, where it begins with like our hero, who is this android named Mother, who's looking after killed children, going on board this ship and just murdering everyone and committing mass murder, and they're stuck on this planet where because they believe that Earth is uninhabitable now, and there's a few survivor human race on this planet, and there's like warring factions like the atheists and these believers, and it was just really a bleak show. And this episode, I think, was probably one of the more interesting episodes of the show, and it really like kicked off the show with a bang. So next is my number 14, which is The Watchman. Great Lindelof show. I wasn't expecting to like this show because I wasn't that big fan of The Watchman, particularly that Zack Snyder movie, which I did not really care for. But you know, the show, and especially this pilot episode, totally was not what I expected, because it kicked everything off with a flashback to the real-life Tulsa riots, race riots, in which lots of African Americans were murdered, and that was a very shocking way to start the show. And then fast forward to this alternate future, present, I should say, where there's superheroes running around like crazy, and the way that they sort of play on race relations and how they present this weird alternate future. And it's not really The Watchmen, it's more like a sequel spinoff to The Watchmen. But yeah, the pilot episode like really did an amazing job of sort of setting it up and setting the stage exactly how the tone of the rest of the show would go. So next we'll get into my number 13, which is The Expanse. Now, if you know anything about my feelings of The Expanse, it's usually like at the top of my list. In fact, I did name this show my favorite show of all time. It is definitely, yeah, it's definitely one of them, and I definitely love the show a lot. But I will admit that the first season was probably the weakest season, and it did take it a little while to catch its stride, because I did think that they struggled a bit with world building and throwing too much information at the audience all at once, where it became a bit confusing. And there was a little bit in that in the pilot, particularly with the Miller storyline and how they're relating the Belters and the Earthers, and they kind of threw a lot at you, and it didn't really all stick. But I think the storyline that introduced the crew of the Canterbury, and the whole pilot episode ended with their ship exploding and our main character's love interest dying, which was a really, really shocking way to and that's not something I would expect at all from a pilot episode. And so it really did sort of throw you in there and really give you some of the tone of what the show would end up doing much better. So next is my number 12, Star Trek Prodigy. I thought this was a great pilot episode, a great way to introduce these characters. It set the stage for these kids who were being held out of prison and doing a prison break. Of course, it is a kids show, so it had this lighthearted tone to it, but this really sort of dark, foreboding tone, like that underlined that lighthearted tone. And I think it was introduced the characters naturally, one at a time, through great storytelling. So I thought it was a very effective first episode. So next is my number 11, which is Lovecraft Country. This show got canceled after only one season, even though it was very popular at the time it first aired. And it was interesting because as the show went on, every episode had a very different, distinct genre to it, which is an interesting way to run a show. But the first episode, I remember, again, it really dealt with the heart of the issue, the heart of the racism, as it was about African Americans living in the 60s, and how, or maybe it was the 50s, I can't remember. But anyway, is how prevalent it was. In this episode in particular, Sundown dealt with sundown counties or sundown towns, which basically said if you were caught after sundown in that town, if you were black, then the people who lived there had every right to kill you or lynch you. And what a terrifying, and it really goes to the heart of just how terrible, and apparently there were still some sundown towns even today, just and how these African Americans who were planning a road trip had to carefully plot it out to avoid places where they wouldn't be lynched and killed. It's like it really hit it down, and of course it added the fantastical supernatural elements to this episode as well. I thought it was a very poignant way to start the show. So next we'll get into my number 10, getting into my top 10 now, starting with my number 10, which is House of the Dragon. I will say that Game of Thrones did not make my list, because I did think the pilot episode for Game of Thrones was actually kind of weak. It was never one of my favorites. It just relied too much on the twincest shock, but the rest was just like, oh, here's the people in Winterfell meeting the people of King's Landing. I thought it was actually kind of dull, and I pitched alternate ways they could have done it better. So I actually think House of the Dragon did a better job at it. The first episode was sort of more encompassing of the story. It ran through more time, and it really did set the stage on how it was happening, with the starting with the line of secession being blurry, and then having the visceral way in which women were treated in this time period, as the king's wife died in childbirth, and they seemed much more concerned with what he thought in trying to save the life of the baby than her life, and just how that affected the daughter and his estranged brother. They did a good job of introducing him. So yeah, I think it was just a really great way to put all the pieces into place, and also telling a really interesting story at the same time that got you invested right away. So next I'll get into my number 9, which is Star Trek Voyager. I've been on record saying that this was my favorite pilot episode of the 90s Trek, 90s era Trek, because I thought it did a great job of introducing the characters, but also setting the stage for what the show is going to be. Of course, this set up the show as it was about a ship trapped in the Delta Quadrant. So this is like a very important episode, as it shows how they got trapped there and the struggles they had to try to get out, and how these two crews, the Maquis crew and the Starfleet crew, had to work together to get out of the situation. And I think it's impressive as a pilot episode because it does a good job of blending, introducing all these main characters and doing it through a very interesting, exciting story at the same time, which is what I think any good pilot should do. And it's harder to do on an ensemble cast show like that. So next we'll get into my number 8, which is Orphan Black. Now Orphan Black, it's a decent show. I think, again, I really liked the first season, but then the second and third season kind of lost me, particularly the third season. And then the fourth season got good again, but then the fifth season lost me again. So it didn't really have that good of a track record going forward, but it did grab my attention right away with the pilot episode. With the first episode, I think, was very catchy and very sort of exciting, introducing the concept of, just a regular woman living her life and all of a sudden finding another woman who looks exactly like her, and and then finding out there's even more people who look exactly like her, and finding out that she's a clone, and this completely changing her life and leading to these weird investigations where all this shit is going on with people. It was a really interesting concept, and I think maybe done almost the best in this first episode. So next we'll get into my number 7, which is Star Trek Picard. Now Picard is another example of a show that kind of went off the rails later on. Its first season would be of mixed quality, would have some terrible things, some great things. Season 2, don't even get me started on that. It was absolutely so terrible, and season 3 was practically a different show. But the pilot episode, I have been on record on it being one of the newer Star Trek shows that just grabbed me right away. I thought it was immensely interesting, immensely exciting, introducing the whole storyline with this woman who's just having a good time with her fiance, and all of a sudden assassins show up and kill him and try to kill her, and then she finds out she has this secret fighting powers, and she's hardwired to go to Picard for help, and it's like a good mystery, and then you find out she's actually an android and Data's daughter, which makes Picard even more sort of hell-bent on helping her, and it makes it more personal for him. And also the episode does a good job of setting up Picard, what he's been up to through these years, and how he's become estranged from Starfleet. So overall, all in all, I think it was a great pilot episode. So next we'll get into my number 6, which is Battlestar Galactica. This, of course, is the Ronald D. Moore 2000s version. And so this was more of, it was actually introduced more as a TV series or TV movie, like a limited series, and then they made a show after it. But so they begin the show by ending the world, by having a robot apocalypse where these Cylons kill everyone, where they introduce us to this world where there's 9, or I can't remember exactly, 12 different worlds, I believe. 12 different worlds, and a whole entirely different human society. But first thing they do is destroy it all and kill everyone, and then follow these small group of survivors, particularly on an elite ship that was able to escape the apocalypse because it was not, networked to all the other ships because it was so elite, obsolete, I should say, is the only reason they survived. And the few survivors, civilian survivors, like Secretary of Education becoming the new president of this dwindling humanity that was dwindled down to a handful of ships trying to invade under constant threat of the Cylons, who are trying to finish the job of wiping out all humanity. Like, that's a pretty freaking serious way to start your show, and I think that was absolutely really effective. So next, we'll get into my number 5, which is Strange New Worlds. I've been on record saying it's my favorite modern Star Trek show, and I think it started off with a bang, really, introducing you the characters as this, as I talked about before, but doing it through an interesting storyline. And this storyline I actually think really works because it sort of gets to the heart of what Star Trek is all about, and it gets into some really poignant, great political commentary, but at the same time, introducing a strange new world, and how Pike found out that they actually inadvertently affected this world, and this world is on the verge of destroying itself, and it's their fault. So he decides that the Prime Directive doesn't apply and decides to violate it in order to save this world. And also deals with a lot of personal character stories involving Pike knowing his future and that he's going to end up paralyzed, and him having to deal with that. It's very powerful stuff. It was a great way to start the show, so I thought it was an amazing first episode. So next we'll get into my number 4, which is Lost. Very notedly, Lost, I think, is a very well-known, great pilot episode. Honestly, it was never one of my favorite episodes of Lost, because I thought Lost got so much better once they started introducing the characters more, once they started getting into the mysteries more, where this episode kind of dragged a bit at places, especially focusing on characters like Boone and Shannon that you don't really care about. And it was, in some ways, your typical disaster movie cliche, but it had elements of it that did definitely elevate it from that, and it really did a great job of introducing these characters. Of course, the whole plane crash scene was epic. A lot of people were saying it was cinematic. It was like they were surprised to see this on TV. I think this was in the early days when television started becoming more cinematic and epic than what people were expecting, and Lost is really noted for that, and it did actually do an amazing job of getting you in the mindset of these survivors who just survived this disaster. So it was even better than most disaster movies. So even though I do think the show did get better after this episode, of course it didn't. It got worse towards the end of the show, but that's another story. But I still think it's a great pilot episode. So next, we'll get into my number 3, Breaking Bad. Now, again, Breaking Bad is a show I talked about before that I think got better every year. Like, season 1 is probably my least favorite season, season 2 my second least favorite, and then it got better in season 3, got even better in season 4, and it got even better in season 5. And so, and again, in a long scheme of things, the pilot episode of Breaking Bad is not one of my favorite episodes of the show. But I remember being blown away by this pilot, and I remember thinking, like, this pilot could have been its own movie. Like, if they had just released a movie that was just that into the movie theaters, I thought it would be a pretty damn good movie. And so, again, it did an amazing job of introducing the characters. It really delved into what the themes of the show was going to be. Of course, it really hit hard on its premise of a high school teacher deciding to cook crystal meth. and it just, how ridiculous that was, but then also playing on the sort of tragedy of that and getting into this character's ego, something of course they would play on more later in the season. But yeah, I thought it was a pretty epic way to start the show. So next we'll get into my number 2, which is Loki. Loki's the only MCU Marvel show that makes this list. I think the pilot episode of this show was just as good as every other episode, but every other episode was amazing. It's like this show was amazing week to week. But the first episode in particular, set the stage and for the really weird, dynamic, interesting, I would say stylized tone that the show had dealing with the TVA, because it introduced the whole premise of the show that this is the Loki from Endgame who took the Tesseract and disappeared, but by doing so he's creating an alternate timeline so the TVA show up to prevent him from doing so and, take them to their sort of headquarters for holding, and just how weird it is, and there's like machines that undress him, and then he goes into this weird thing where he's supposed to take a number and it really play on the whole boring bureaucracy thing, but do it in this weird stylized way, and that really sets, of course, the tone for the show, and how Loki is this megalomaniac godlike creature who's finding himself being overpowered and forced against his will to do things by a larger power, and him having to deal with that. And then of course Owen Wilson's character finding seeing something in Loki and seeing that they could use him and finding a way to sort of bond with him. It was a really good, start to this whole buddy cop thing they had going. So yeah, I read that pilot episode absolutely stuck with me. So we will get into my number 1 favorite series premiere or pilot episode, and that is actually going to be Ozark. Now, Ozark, you might be surprised if you're familiar with my channel, because I don't really talk about the show that much. It doesn't really make any money in my top list. I think, when I had season 3 on, has number 9 or 10 of my favorite shows that came out that year. Because the thing is, I do think Ozark got really boring and really slow paced. Not that it was a terrible show. I think it tried to be too much like Breaking Bad in some ways and didn't succeed, so it always lived in its shadow, in my opinion. And the pace did get too slow at times, particularly in the later seasons, and sometimes they, followed through all these storylines on characters I didn't really care about, or they dragged out the story for too long. But that, despite my feelings of the rest of the show, that pilot episode blew me the fuck away. I think if I were to rate the favorite episodes of the show, the pilot episode or the premiere episode, the first episode, would easily be my favorite of the show. I found it so intense and so fresh, and even it shocked me to see this be the first episode of a show where these money launderers are encountered by who are laundering money for the cartel, or encountered by the cartel, who come in there and start killing them, and go to their office and they just kill a woman at random because they believe that one of them is cheating them. And the guy finally does admit to cheating them, and he's killed. And so this other guy who's his partner has to convince them not to kill him, but they're out for his family. And then he goes out and he finds that his wife is cheating on him with the lawyer, and they end up killing the guy that the wife is cheating on him with, but he has to convince his wife who is going to leave him, by the way, but he has to convince them to move to Ozark in Missouri in order to keep laundering money for the cartels. It was It was just so fucking intense, and I just, again, it's like I couldn't believe, like, you know, he did this in the very first episode. Now, again, as I said, after this first episode, it kind of slowed down and got a bit dull, but that first episode blew me the fuck away. And I think it was probably one of the most impressive pilot episodes. I guess I am saying it is because it is my number one on my list. So, goddamn, that was hard, and I don't know if I could. I'll probably change my mind week to week, day to day, on the exact ordering of this, but that's what I came up with as my top 15 favorite pilot episodes / series premiere episodes of my favorite shows. So thank you so much for watching this video. Thanks for Ricky for requesting this video, and of course a big shout out, thank you for everyone who supports me on Patreon. I'll just give a quick shout out for those who do. We have Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Lavalles, Alessandro Miguelcio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neilhouse. Thank you all so very, very much for your support, and if you would like to support me on Patreon, it would be very much appreciated. If you do $10 or more, you can request videos like this one, and I shall do them. So thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channels for many more videos. I will be starting my coverage of Star Trek The Next Generation soon, episode by episode, also Strange New Worlds, which will be coming out soon, so be sure to check that out as I cover that and many more videos, and thanks a lot for watching.